My name is Sachin Sharma, and on behalf of HarperCollins India, I welcome you all on this wonderful evening as we celebrate the publishing of our book, Reform Nation. Reform Nation captures the story of our nation's growth, riding on economic reforms. For the generation that was born post the 90s, and I see some of them here, it would be difficult to imagine the India of 60s, 70s, or 80s. I, for example, was born in the 80s and was witness, in part, to the era of an inward looking nation, a nation where gas cylinders and telephones were considered luxury, where a tenure waiting for a scooter was considered normal. Now, how did a nation move from a state of scarcity to high-end cars and smartphones? How did a nation that depended on homegrown products embrace global luxury brands? Not only that, what led India to become the world's sixth largest economy, with all indicators pointing to it becoming the world's third largest economy within this decade? Gautam Chikermane has captured the journey of India's economic reforms brilliantly. An astute observer of India's economy and politics, Gautam is both passionate and optimistic when you engage with him on any topic related to India's growth. To grace this evening, we have with us the Honorable Finance Minister, Nirmala Sitharaman ji, Dr. Bibek Debroy, Chairman Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, former Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission and Distinguished Fellow, CSEP, Dr. Shamika Ravi, Vice President Economic Policy at ORF, and of course our author, Gautam Chikermane. Without much ado, I would now like to invite all the esteemed guests to the podium to formally unveil the book. I would now invite Dr. Saran to take it from here.
Thank you, Sachin, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Let me also congratulate Gautam for producing yet another book. I think this is your third this year. And it's only because he had to travel for 2 weeks to Europe that he couldn't write his fourth. He's been a little slow this time. I, of course, want to praise Gautam like Sachin did, passionate, optimistic, but I also want to highlight a virtue that is very important for those who engage with India. You also have to be relentless and prolific. India is not a distant story. It's a story that requires deep engagement. It requires constant engagement. It requires attention to some of the subterranean stories that are unfolding and expressing themselves through people, through institutions, through its politics. And many a times, a detached assessment of India leads us to wrong conclusions. Gautam is not one of those. Gautam believes in the India story, is living the India story, and thankfully, we have people like Gautam who are now writing about the India story. And that, I think, is most important as we move from where we are today to where we would be in the coming decades. It's also very important to note that alongside this prolific author, and in some ways, it is fitting that one of our most outstanding finance ministers is gracing the occasion to release this book. And I say this with consideration. She has led the country through 3 years, which were by no means something anyone could have been trained for. We saw a once-in-a-century pandemic. We saw Europe go back to its old ways and engage in conflict. And we saw all of us suffering from its collateral impact. Without much ado, without noise, without fanfare, she has guided the ship through troubled waters. This book, although may seem to be about hard economics, I think it is equally important to read this book about economic statecraft. Gautam has elegantly embedded future drivers of reforms, in some sense, Gautam's constant plea to reform more in this work of his. He has engaged with issues like geopolitics, the impact of technology, and of course, global economic postures as he produced this book. It is also in many ways a blueprint for us to engage with as we reappraise our days ahead. It is also a book on how to negotiate for all of us as individuals and as communities and countries, our place in a world that will continue to challenge us. I see this not as just an economics book, but also as a reference book, a handbook on the Indian economy. Everyone talks about reforms, but what do they really mean? In Reform Nation, Gautam has showcased 69 key reforms, from idea to policy, in brief but academically rigorous manner. He also has deep dives into 8 industrial policies that shaped a different narrative and argues that finally, in 1991, the nation started to breathe again. Anyone wanting to write about India's economic journey would do well to keep this book handy. And finally, apart from being a book on economic policy, Reform Nation also talks about the politics behind the economics. As a result, this book is a must-read for those interested in engaging with India's complex political economy. It tells us about the people, the politics, the perceptions of the time that it traces. I congratulate Gautam, and it gives me great honor. It's a privilege of mine to invite our Finance Minister, Honorable Nirmala Sitharaman ji, to speak to us on this occasion. Ma'am, mic is yours.
Good evening to the author of the book, to the publisher, to Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Bibek, Debroy, Shamika, Ravi, who are on the dais, and also the eminent gathering before me. I'm very pleased to be here to be part of, what should I call it, unveiling of the book, releasing of the book, because it's obviously available since September of 22. But of course, in this era, book discussions happen as the release also happens, just as we've released this book. And this is probably the first one where a discussion is happening on a very, very contemporarily relevant book. It's a very well done book, a book which is a result of intensive labor, in that as we read the book, you also realize how difficult it is to get data, how difficult it is to get some of these very critical documents. And therefore, for Gautam to have put in that kind of energy and time to compile it, bring it all together with authentic references, is a great service towards understanding Indian economy. As was mentioned earlier, it of course tracks how post-independence, leading towards 1991, 8 major steps which have been taken in the name of policies, and probably 11 prime ministers guided the economy through those years, which resulted in 1991, under compulsion or under conviction, a major reform happened. And till before that, a reform of that kind hadn't. And we have the author of 91 reform, along with many others, the author, Dr. Ahluwalia, being present here, which is itself something which all of us can look forward to hearing his views, because he's been in the thick of those days, knows how exactly it happened. If thick of those days is something which we will love to hear about, and I'm sure 30 years from now you will hear about the pandemic time reform as an opportunity which happened. So time has its own advantage, but now we have the advantage that time gives us in the author, in the way in which he's looking back at it, with the advantage again of the writer or the person who was in the thick of things as well being here, which is a rare advantage for all of us. So not just looking back at it from historical perspective or also from the secondary data that you have, but actually the makers of the reform 1991, at least one of them, is here with us. So it will be interesting to hear Dr. Ahluwalia's picture of how 91 happened. But since after 91, 6 prime ministers, as how Gautam has recollected in the book, 6 prime ministers, but 69 major steps, all of which are reform-oriented, have all happened. And this book, therefore, looks at what was before 91 and what's after 91. Of course, gives us a picture pre-47 as well, when he's looking at the Bombay Plan and how, since then, although it has been kept in the sidelines since after independence, since then, overtly or covertly, Bombay Plan has been influencing all our thoughts and the policymakers. Not just that, it gave birth to the Planning Commission, and not just that, it influenced the first plan in a very detailed manner. So India has been fortunate that in spite of the British rule and in spite of the way in which we have wrenched out a lot of what is India post the colonial rule since 47, and had the advantage of going through several rounds of thinking and planning for the country. But as Gautam would put it in his book, 91 saw reform from earlier being under sort of repressive regime, in the sense of economy being controlled, economy being regulated tightly, and economy also being under strict license regulations. So he very effectively carries through the spirit of how the economy has come to be what it is today, and very effectively also looks at what it would have been if the route had been slightly different, in that the Bombay Plan had envisaged a certain way of entrepreneurial way of thinking about it, although it was drafted by large, very big businessmen, addressing poverty but yet keeping the entrepreneurial skill intact was probably the spirit with which the Bombay Plan was written. But then later, of course, some of the recommendations of the Bombay Plan did find its way in several of the plans, but the overall shroud with which the economy was taken forward was not necessarily in the spirit of the Bombay Plan. It's not my intention here to say the Bombay Plan is all very glorified and it should have been fully carried through. But the author captures the essence of how that ran parallel, but yet the spirit of the 47 to 91 was slightly different from the spirit of what was in Bombay Plan. So that's been beautifully captured. And also the international context has also been very well captured by the author. Listing out of the various reforms since after 91 and even the ones before, and probably giving just a page or a page and a half for each of them makes it easy for people who would want to have a quick picture of how it's flown since 47 to today. So that's a very good attractive feature for any reader. I'm sure most of you all have read it, but for those who have not read it, I think that would be one of the features, saying very quick picture of how reform after reform India has been building. And the momentum has been far more since 91, the numbers themselves speak. He captures 69 post 1991 and only 8 before 1991. So the pace at which reforms have happened and the kinds of reforms, whether it is governance reform, taxation reform, or policy reform, regulatory reform, he captures it all. So that way, it's an exhaustive attempt at getting the picture of how economy and reforms feed into each other. The only speed breaker, if any, which is also very well captured by the author, is the political conviction. Sometimes the priority of those in politics and also the decision makers, how they come into play either positively or otherwise, is also well captured, and the difficulties of taking decision in 91 finds a very detailed narrative. So that way, I think you've spent a lot of time in looking at how the processes have worked in favor sometimes, and some other times, even if the economic arguments are very much in favor, political conviction is available as well. Taking the example of the 3 farm laws, which had to be withdrawn, where the political conviction is there, the stability of regime is there. Talking about the Washington consensus, he goes into those details as well. Political consensus or the political stability, conviction for reforms, all of them existing, notwithstanding, the farm laws had to be withdrawn. And there, the author rightly says, there is no economic argument against it. Because year after year after year, several committees, several standing committees, several specifically appointed committees, all of them have gone into the virtues of reforming farm businesses. But yet it couldn't find the light of the day. So the trajectory that reforms in India take up, sometimes very bumpy, sometimes like a cycle you come back, have all been very beautifully captured. The fact that he captures the economy, its profile, and the way in which things have changed since after 91 is very beautifully represented by the fact that he says that when in 86 the stock market indices, the Sensex came in, from among the 30 companies then, there are only 6 which continue to be. Am I right? You've quoted that. There are only 6 that continue to be in the Sensex list today. Many new companies have come in, others have all dropped out. Just 6 of the 30, which means the profile of the Indian economy as related to sensitive, big-time, influential, stable companies which find a listing is changed so much. So that itself tells you what reform has done for the economy and why further reforms are necessary. But of course, he goes into greater detail of how reforms get strengthened by institutional support. And there he has that beautiful string of thought to say how the American way of thinking, American institutions, American think tanks, all support policy making, which to an extent was also shadowed in India. Then you have the institutions probably taken over by the left philosophies, left ideologies. And therefore you have Indian policy making also very, very much infused with that kind of a flavor. You have then the left and the left liberals. And so it goes, as much as it's happening in the US, the Chinese, whose influence, whose model, Chinese model of growth, which influences the thought processes in the universities or think tanks, which happened till very recently in the academia in the US. All this is also captured, and I'm happy to see that at one go he stretches the full semicircle of the umbrella. And even as he does that, he comes back to talking about the individual reforms, like trickles of water which, hit the umbrella but yet get sprayed down to the earth. So the looking into details getting into specifics, at the same time, every time going back to weave the theoretical framework behind it, are very interesting, and it's something which I think gives the reader the advantage within a book of what in the last 75 years India has gone through in the name of planning for economy. A very interesting fact which comes out of this book, but which gives a lesson for policymakers, is institutional memory will have to be something in which all of us will have to invest. When he talks about the way in which he gathered information on the Bombay plan, for instance, he says, I've put in much more effort than is required to even find a copy of it. Am I right? Tells you how much a critical document for India's economy and its planning, which should have been natural course available easily for anybody, requires a researcher of that kind of a level to spend so much time. Doesn't speak so much for us, for our documentation abilities and for our institutional memory purposes. These are things which I would strongly take it for myself, at least, that we should strengthen the institutional memory, which is so important for us. Similarly, he talks about tracing and tracking difficulties of the 1948 resolution. It was called the resolution, but it was one of the major steps, one of the major 8 steps that was pre-1991. Gautam was right in saying even that it was very difficult for him to obtain. So I think it is very important that books such as this are not read just for references or not just read for the sake of knowing what the content is about, but the messages they give in terms of documentation, preserving certain historical evidences are so critical. And it's right that you have mentioned it, and I think it's important for India to remember that as we sit in Nehru Memorial Museum Library, it is important to document, it is important to keep a very good catalogue, and it's important to make it available for researchers in time. To end the discussions, he also comes up with the triple trinity that India will have to face as we go forward. And that was a very enchanting way of putting out as to what is important, where the attention of the policymakers should go. I quite appreciate it. It's worth recalling. He says the first trinity is of technology, geopolitics, and narrative building. Very relevant for today. And the next trinity that he talks about is producers, consumers, and regulators, the essential stakeholders in an economy, which actually the set of 3 would always be the ones at play, and that's what is going to give the economy its robustness. And the third one is very futuristic, somewhat abstract, and if you have to derive policy from it, it's going to take a bit of effort. But nevertheless, the third trinity is where he says dismantle the colonial legal framework. The legal infrastructure that prevails will have to be dismantled. I thought it had a semblance to what the Prime Minister has been speaking as Panch Pran, where the first of it is to get over that mindset, get over the colonial mindset, is what the Prime Minister has been saying from Red Fort, August 15th, 2022. And here I find the third trinity, the first one in the third trinity, triple trinity, is to dismantle the colonial legal infrastructure. The second in that is to reinstate India as a major player in the global economy. And third, he says that India should play a very important and pivotal role in redrafting emerging new world order, which is, I think, a very important job. And representing the voice of the South is what the PM has been speaking about, particularly in the context of the G20, in which India holds the presidency this year. So representing the voice of the South and also speaking for greater representation of the South in multilateral institutions, be it banking or multilateral funding institutions, India, together with the South, global South, will have to find its place. And the reform of the multilateral institutions, certainly something which we will put on the top of our agenda. So, in a way, without taking much of your time, I find this is a very time-serving today, in the sense, very contemporaneously required, necessary manual, if I can call this book that. And it comes out with very important reference material for us, gives a very good picture of the Indian economy. Just one thing which I would want to say, with a little apologies. I don't want to get into specifics of what is in the book, but this is, I thought, important. In Reform 16, it's mentioned about how new normal for personal income tax rates. Thankfully, the only place in which my name appears. It says, and I read here, under Prime Minister H.D. Deve Gowda, Finance Minister P. Chidambaram, created a three-part tax structure, 10%, 20%, 30%, that remained unchanged until recently. This elegant structure continued till under the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman brought 7 slabs and 4 surcharges, reversing the gains of simplicity created after decades of harassment. Unquote. And if Gautam would pardon me, if Gautam would pardon me, if indeed they were gains of simplicity, I want to reassure him, they've not been reversed. People are filing taxes, their returns even today under it. I have not reversed any of this, nor has Prime Minister Modi reversed this gains of simplicity. It still is there. But it's not at all simple, I would want to tell you that. It has full of exemptions. For every rate there are, for every tax assessee, it has about 7, 8, 9, 10 exemptions. And with all that exemptions, the rate 10, 20, 30 continue. It continues even today, I assure you, we've not removed it. But what we have done in the name of simplicity and to avoid harassment, reversing the gains of simplicity created after decades of harassment. Removing harassment is what was aimed at when we brought in faceless tax assessment. And even today I can tell you with certain level of confidence that if there are harassment or if people are willing to talk about it, there is a system through which it gets sorted out. So harassment was addressed by us, 1. Second, in order to keep the simplicity and not deny those who want to enjoy the old simplicity, we've kept that system intact, it continues. But we've come up with a parallel system which has no exemptions whatsoever, but which has simpler, more favorable rates. And may not be the time for me to bicker on statistics, but I'd like to say this here. The reason why I had to bring in 7 slabs was to make simpler and lower rates for those who are in the lower incomes. So just indulge me for a moment. The old tax system, which still continues, had only 5, 20, and 30 slabs other than the nil rate. And 10 lakh and above were under 30%. 5 to 10 lakhs were under 20%. 2.5 to 5 lakhs were under 5%. And those below 2.5 were at nil rate. So what we did in bringing a new parallel system without exemptions of any kind, you just pay that amount and you're done with, was to bring in, yes, 7 slabs, only to make sure that those below 10 and below were not going to be taxed at 30%, they were going to be taxed at only 15%. We reduced it. We reduced it further down to 5% for 2.5 and 5 lakhs and so on. So no one, till they reached 15 lakh and above, had to pay 30% at all. So for everyone, there was a reduction by at least 5 to 10% in the tax rates, and no exemptions were allowed. It was a straightforward. So just one little correction. And in fact, probably I would have given the little advantage to correct it had only I had the opportunity to meet up with the author before the book was finalized. Unfortunately, I didn't have the chance of meeting him or even having any discussion about the book because I didn't even know that he was writing one. So pardon me for doing this here, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Finance Minister. I'm sure the second release will have the corrected narrative. Now I'm delighted to invite the author to speak to us about his book, his product of his passion and engagement with the Indian economy, Gautam Chikermane. Gautam, over to you.
Good evening, everybody. Delighted to be here, and even more delighted by the critique of our finance minister. I will read the numbers myself, and if there is course correction, make those corrections. Thank you for coming here, Nirmala ji. I thought there could be nobody better to launch this book or talk about this book than you. As Samir mentioned earlier, you have steered our economy through the most tumultuous times. It's not easy facing flak every other day for the smallest of policy gaps, lapses, implementation, execution, data change, global events, etc. It's not easy. And more than the policy itself, I would like to commend you on behalf of all of us here and many outside for the courage with which you have gone and faced this harsh waters and steered us through safely. Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you, Bibek ji. You are an inspiration always. The joke at ORF is by the time we finish writing a policy brief, or some people even a small article, Bibek Debroy has come out with a new book, and that keeps me inspired. So the 3 books this year that have come out, last year that came out, a lot of that inspiration comes from you, Bibek ji. Thank you very much. Montek ji, you've been an inspiration right from my past life in journalism. You may not recall I was a rookie reporter, but I would come to you for advice, for windows into the policies. I would study your plans, your reports that would come out, and I thought you were quite up there, and by gracing this occasion here, I'm really honored. Thank you very much. Thanks Samir, thanks Shamika for being here, and thank you everybody for coming. I want to make 5 points, actually, the first of which is around, and most worryingly, this wasn't part of my speech earlier, but it happened later, is about deforms. I think there is a political narrative that is gathering momentum today that is attempting to reverse the gains of reforms that have happened over the past 3 decades and lead us back to the backwaters of past. Specifically, I'm talking about pension deforms. After a long time, in 2006, we moved the government servants to a new pension system. The previous system was fiscally not viable, and everything was hunky-dory, everything was well, and I think it's a fantastic system that was functioning very well. And suddenly, out of the blue, politics comes, and now 3 states, Himachal Pradesh, Punjab, and Chhattisgarh, are looking to go back and deform the pension system, deform their balance sheets, and go back to the old pension system, which is a defined benefit system from the defined contributions. I sincerely hope better sense prevails in these three states because they will not see their books getting balanced at all. I also see a lot of struggle between the union government and these three states in terms of asking for the monies of the people there. I don't know from where these reforms have come, but they are spreading like COVID. Today, I read an article that in Karnataka, which is a BJP-governed state, government servants are demanding the return of old pension scheme. So in Jammu and Kashmir, this disease may continue. We need to keep our fiscal bearings in place and prevent this distortion from happening again. This book began as a tribute to the 30 years of economic reforms. I wanted to celebrate what these reforms were. Usually I write a book when I want to do something and I don't find any literature available. My previous book, which was also launched here, one of my previous books was launched here, was the result of the same thing. So I wanted to dissect what happened to us, what happened to our economy from 1991. Why did we get there? I've been tracking it for a long time, but I wanted to do it this time with greater depth, and I was quite shocked. From celebrating the 30 years of reforms through the 69 reforms that Nirmala ji just mentioned, I also had to deep dive into finding why we reached where we did, what made us get here. How come China moved forward? How come South Korea moved ahead? How come India got left behind? Why did this happen? So I had to sort of excavate the old policies, the 8 industrial policies, and it's a story that will make any policy student deeply distressed to see how we were captured, how a policy distortion took place, how we were all misled. And it's only how, after Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao initiated the industrial policy in 1991, that we began to breathe afresh again. My third point is, so there is enough in the book I don't want to repeat, and I will now talk outside the book. When I read the book as a reader now, I see 4 lessons. First, I don't think economic policy can be made in the rooms of economists anymore. I think economic policy needs a legal awareness. I think the intrusion of law into economic policy is a crucial intrusion for any policy analyst to look at. For instance, while the statement on industrial policy in 1991 talked about removing the MRTPC, finally it was through law that it was done. The GST, and everything that we talk about through a policy statement converts itself into law, and understanding legislation, understanding how law functions, understanding the judgments of the Supreme Court, which again turn into law, and putting them in context of policy making is a crucial skill today. No economist can stand alone today anymore. You have to read the laws, rules, regulations, statutes before you dive deeper or give any advice. Second point is, I find, although there are several new policies that come out, for instance, Statement on Industrial Policy 1991 or the Jan Dhan Yojana, these are new ideas, new reforms. But mostly what I've seen is that reforms are a work in progress. For instance, the Mahatma Gandhi NREGA, MG NREGA, which is the most talked about scheme and probably the world's greatest income security for the rural people scheme in the world, actually has its roots in 1952 through the Community Development Program. Since then, it has been honed through several years in 1977, 1983, 1989, to reach 2006, where we have now MGNREGA, which provides income security. Likewise, GST, likewise for several others. So when you enter a policy debate, I'm talking to students here, be sure to go into history and context and see the evolution, and to which you will add something more. The third point is credit. I don't think we have given adequate credit to the 2 biggest reformers that India has seen in the last 30 years. First, Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao. Everybody in this room, well, I hope not, but maybe most people that I have spoken to think that the 1991 reforms, the credit should go to Finance Minister Manmohan Singh rather than Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. When you read those documents and when you see it in hindsight, for instance, Manmohan Singh ji's track record as Prime Minister, you see that actually you needed a leadership of a different caliber that P.V. Narasimha Rao provided and which Manmohan Singh ji implemented. But when it came to giving that leadership himself, I think he faltered. He did some good things like NREGA or right to education or RTI, right to information. But on the economic wealth creation front, I think he lagged the curve. The other person who has not got adequate credit is Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Everybody looks at him or talks about him, and so did I. So I also believed it, that he's more of a political person, a person looking at electoral politics rather than economic reforms. But when you start counting the reforms in this book, as I hope you will see that most of the big reforms that have happened under any other Prime Minister, the highest number are happening under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He's not seen to be a reformer, but is. Finally, I want to talk about protests. Every reform has had its protests. In fact, my first chapter talks about a tale of two protests. The first protest happened in 1991, actually in 1993, through what is known as the Bombay Club, led by Rahul Bajaj, who said that the change from a controlled regime to something which is open, where foreign investors can come, foreign companies can compete, is unfair. We don't have a level playing field. We are not used to functioning under such constraints, and I think he had a point. I think the Bombay Club had a point. You can't just overnight decide to say that the regulatory structure of yesterday is changing, and now you fight the global giants overnight. So they had an economic case. Whether you like it or not, that's a separate matter. But they had no political support. As a result, they were not heard. But what has resulted in the process is that although Rahul Bajaj lost, Bajaj Auto has won. The other protest, the big protest, comes 30 years later in 2021, where the three fantastic farm laws, Nirmala ji mentioned them also, had to be repealed for no rhyme or reason. 20 years of debate. 20 years of debates by the best minds, the best agriculture economists, by the parliamentary committee meetings, by standing committees of parliament, said that these three laws, not precise laws, but the essence of those three laws must be there. It would be a 1991 moment for the farmers, for the poor and marginal farmers. They were, through violence, through protests. I couldn't believe what I was seeing in Delhi. I think it was just terrible. Murders, killings, brutality. And suddenly, those reforms had to be repealed. So again, every reform will have a protest. Income tax reforms have had a protest. Income tax people were complaining, it's there in the book, and I've given citations, so it's not my word or he said, she said, that they said that you cannot do faceless income tax because our children, what will happen to the education of our children? Random things. Every person who is vested in the present will fight against the future, and we need to be careful. The pension reforms that I talked about earlier, what effectively they are saying is that 5% of India's households must be subsidized, of India's affluent households must be subsidized by 95% of the India's poor. This is ridiculous, and I don't think we need to go back there, but protests will continue. On future reforms, I believe we will have a discussion there. I'm lucky that we have existing reformers and yesterday's reformers to talk about tomorrow's reforms. But I just want to point one reform that I think is essential for tomorrow, and which is the compliance reforms. My friend and co-author Rishi is sitting right here. We wrote a book, we wrote a monograph earlier this year. It's called Jailed for Doing Business, where we talked about 69,233 compliance universe of doing business in India, of which 24,134 carry imprisonment clauses. There is a bill in Parliament now that is attempting to remove these imprisonment clauses. It's up for debate. We have given our views. We hope that the bill will get expanded. Even if it doesn't, I think it's a great start, and we must push harder and get rid of what Nirmala ji was talking about, the colonial infrastructure, which I mentioned towards the end of my book. This is part of that colonial legal infrastructure. This must end. Finally, I want to give my gratitude to some people. Firstly, to all the reformers present here in this room and outside. Thank you for those reforms. We are very grateful to you. There is not a single constituency in this country, not a single constituency, that has not benefited from economic reforms. Think about that. There is not a single person who has not benefited from economic reforms. We are grateful to all of them. Second, HarperCollins, my publishers. This was a difficult book to write because, firstly, there was a deadline. Secondly, because it was challenging extant narratives, I had to use primary data. I had to dig in. 1/4 of the book, by the way, is of citations in small fine print. So you can accuse me or you can have a difference of opinion with my analysis, but you cannot have a difference of opinion with my facts. So thank you, HarperCollins, for being there with me. Vinayak Swami, is he here? One of the finest researchers. I never use researchers. I try not to. I'm really afraid of using researchers with the kind of experience that some high-profile people have had. I'm really scared of using researchers. But Vinayak has been a backbone. He has really, he's provided the rigor, and I've certainly enjoyed working with him. You need to do your PhD and become a reformer sitting here. This is my 8th book, 5 of which have been written in the past 5 years, 3 of which have been written in the past 1 year. Now, what has happened in these 5 years? I joined an organization called Observer Research Foundation. This is one of the world's greatest think tanks. It provides intellectual refuge to writers like me. It challenges me. Every day it challenges me, every day it encourages me, and the institutional support that ORF provides is a dream of any scholar. My thanks to Samir, Dr. Joshi, and all my colleagues at ORF. Thank you very much. My family, particularly 3-4 people, they stood by me because in the last 1 year, because I was writing 3 books, I was absent from the dinner tables. So my mother, Lakshmi Chikermane, my father-in-law, Yogesh Hallan, and my wife, Monica Hallan, I'm grateful to you. You power my book and you power my life. Thank you. Finally, my readers, inside here as well as outside, I have just one line for you. You read, therefore I write. Thank you once again. Thank you, Nirmala ji, Bibek ji, Montek ji, Samir, Shamika, delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gautam. And I think I will now hand it over to Shamika to take the discussion forward. Madam Finance Minister, will you be staying with us during the discussion? Shamika, you have an hour, of which maybe 40 minutes of conversations and 20 minutes of Q&A. So I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. So what a engaging start. Thank you, Gautam, for writing this book. Thank you, Nirmala ji, for endorsing this effort. I think researchers, the greatest objective is to document and spur imagination and start conversations. The conversation that we're going to have now is going to be on reforms in general. I think now, instead of just listing, we're all, most of us are Indians here, we've been through the pains and perils of it. For me, when I read this book, it jogged my memory of just each reform and the consecutive or the protests that went along with it. It just tells you that economic reforms will always have protest in a democracy. Because there is no reform. And reforms have, of course, benefited everyone, but each individual reform will have a distributional impact, which means on an average we will gain, but average, remember, is a distribution. Some will gain more, some will actually lose. And then it becomes one of how do you convince the ones who are going to lose of how do they come along, right? We are seeing what is happening in the Western economies. We have seen the anti-globalization moves that are happening, largely on account of the fact that there are groups of demographics, of regions that have missed out simply because jobs have shifted, the nature of production has changed in a lot of these developed markets. And there is a pushback against globalization, but we have gained because of globalization. Just like China, we have gained, most of South Asia has gained, East Asia has gained. The distributional impacts have now begun to take form. And the farm laws are, of course, in your face. We have all seen And for last 40 years, economists across the spectrum, whether you left, right, center, whatever, everyone argued for the same set of things, but we couldn't prevail. So obviously it is not about how good the ideas are. Of course, let's say good ideas, we are abstaining from the complexity of implementation right now. So let's talk about the economics of it, regardless of how good it is. The politics is very much a reality that we have to abide by. That is a constraint that we have to, when we think of reforms, we cannot say, oh, this is a great idea, therefore let's just push it. And that is how we also have to think in terms of the pension scheme and why it is, why is there a surge and why are political parties now thinking and therefore what should be the reaction and the response to some of this. I will start with you, Montek. You have been listening very patiently, and I know you have lived through it, but we also know one other thing, Montek, that you've also had to battle. In fact, most of your detractors in the reform process were people within the party. You actually had several eminent people who didn't fundamentally believe in the pro-growth, the kind of policies that were enacted. What is your biggest lesson from this? What would you recommend moving forward? How do we tackle, I don't want to use the word dissent, it's not really dissent, there is something more sinister about it. In a democracy, how do we manage the people who are getting left behind and who are going to, remember in today's social media space, it's becoming easier to mobilize support. It is no longer India's farm laws alone. We have Canadians getting into the fight, Greta Thunberg getting into the fight. The narrative building is becoming much more difficult and can get out of control. So how do we manage the group that is likely to get lost in any reform?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and congratulations, Gautam. I would, while we've gone into conversation phase, I would like to say that I really enjoyed reading the book, and I recommend people interested in the business of Indian reform to look at it. And the nice thing about it is that the first, 20 pages, which is his preface, well worth reading, and the last 20 or so pages, which is his conclusion, also very rich. And in between, you have a pretty interesting summary of all the different things that have happened. And frankly, one of the things that comes out of the book very strongly is how much reforms are a continuing process. So, whatever our political discourse might be, and you need a political discourse, and that should be allowed to be as contentious as you like. If you look at when is India going to look good? India is going to look good if people believe India's democracy. Being a democracy means there's going to be a lot of contestation. Democratic government is not a consensual form of government. It's an adversarial form of government. So the government will say something, the opposition will oppose it, and people like that. But in the end, it looks best if people say that under all this political disputation and contestation, there's sort of a consensus that the country must move forward, and somehow it does. And I think what comes out from Gautam's book, because he's covered such a wide spectrum, is how many reforms came at different times. Some kind of petered out, some were very important, and others sort of halted, and maybe some have to be carried forward. Still others gain momentum. So making a list of reforms is useful because you can keep it on your shelf, and who knows, some of these things that are stuck today, 5 years later when they get done, you can go back to the book and say, okay, I'll tick that off. It didn't look as if it was happening, but now it's going to happen. And I think it's very important to take a look at that whole process. Now to come to your question. The way you posed it, it's as if reformers go for growth and they don't care about distribution, and you could have gone further and don't care about ecology and don't care about... This is not true. The honest truth is that when we began, we meaning the country, remember when we became independent, we were a pretty poor country. I think the dominant thing was we've got to increase production. with the amount of production there was going to be no sense of prosperity. Then for a long period, particularly during the 1970s, we didn't seem to be able to grow. And those are all the bad policies that Gautam talks about, and they're kind of documented in there. So, it's not surprising that at that time, the dominant concern was, look, here's Southeast Asia growing at 6%. At that time, China wasn't growing that fast, but Korea had grown at 9 or 10%, Japan had done that, and India was growing at 3.5%. So the dominant concern was, let's demonstrate that India, with all our constraints, can get faster growth. But we were all aware that growth has to be inclusive. In fact, in the first plan that I was concerned with, we call it inclusive growth. And then later on, when environment became important, we called it inclusive and sustainable growth. So it is true that the consciousness of things like the environment came later. But right from the beginning, nobody ever thought that growth by itself would be enough. Everybody knew that it needed to get down to the bottom. In fact, in my book, Backstage, I quote an exchange with Prime Minister VP Singh, who was a poet himself, and he said, Montek, we need the kind of growth that falls like rain on the mountains and flows down to the plains. We don't need the growth that's like snow, which sticks to the mountaintop. So, that I think was a very positive way of describing trickle down. Whereas in the West, everybody denigrated trickle down. He would say, look, if it trickles down, it's pretty good. And I think a lot was done and is being done. Even today, there's a lot of focus on the welfarist aspects of policy. They all reflect this concern. But let's be very clear about it. If you don't do growth, this is going to be dead in the water. So while growth is not enough, you should have no doubt whatsoever at our income level, we need it. If you're going to talk about all these $10 trillion, etc., I think Bibek is in the newspaper giving a nice target for what we can achieve. All of that requires growth of somewhere between 7 and 8%. And therefore, nobody should say that I'm not interested in growth, but let's try to get A, B, and C. You won't get that. And I think, if you look back, you talked about resistance. A lot of times, people making the resistance know that it's sort of naam ke vaste. But given where they come from, they have to make the point. I will just mention one incident, which I think also responds to what the Honorable Finance Minister said. Tell us something about what 1991 was like and why it happened. This is a story when it's there in my book, Backstage. One of the important things that were done was computerization of the banks. We could not have gone on the way our bank unions wanted us to, which is no computers at all, okay? So at one point, the finance minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, invited a whole bunch of bank unions. The bank unions belong to different parties, so they're very democratic. You had Congress unions, BJP unions, CPM unions, a lot. So they all came and they all had the same view, no computerization. So Dr. Singh tried to explain to them, India is developing, India has expanding credit needs, we want to integrate with the world, all of that sort of stuff. It was a good meeting, very polite, and as they were about ready to leave, he sort of went to his door to shake hands with each of them. They all sort of shook hands. They were quite pleased that they got so much time with the finance minister. One of them went up to him and said, Mr. Finance Minister, I don't agree with you at all on computerization. And then he said, but I must tell you, my son agrees with you. So, I think they knew it was coming, but, it's like where you stand is where you sit. So I think whoever is doing reforms should not expect that reforms will just happen, that there won't be opposition. That's why you need to consult, you need to talk, you need to persuade. But, in the end, you can't get consensus. You've got to get it done. And, frankly, if you're right, people will realize it's right. And if you get it wrong, you can adjust it. I mean, there's no other way of doing that. This whole idea of getting everybody together and getting agreement, that's really not what reforms are about.
Right. Thank you. Vivek, if I may come to you next. You know, the more I read about the response to PM Modi's economic reforms, particularly from past NAC members, who most of them had a very socialist outlook and some very progressive policies, etc. But a lot of the detractors today are actually, they're all in agreement with the way amenities have improved tremendously in the last 8 years. In fact, I will recommend, particularly to the youngsters in the room, do read the debate between Jean Drèze and Surjit Balla. And they are on the opposite ends of the political spectrum. But when you read through it, it's actually funny because they're both saying that India's multidimensional poverty has fallen significantly. So in essence, we're getting, you know, our broad strokes are all in the right directions. We are accomplishing our broad objectives. The way we are going about it, again, the politics one can differ, but economic reforms, we don't want to lose our sight of the goalpost. So Bibek, moving forward, particularly from the judicial point of view, because you've been writing so passionately, and I endorse a lot of what you're writing. I think these are important conversations. What is the role of the judiciary? How do you foresee moving forward? How do we get the judiciary to be economically more, I don't want to use the wrong word, but economically more literate, economically more sensitive to, you know, as a very prominent judge had said, that there are right decisions and then there are intelligent decisions. And I'm particularly referring to the kind of pronouncements we got in the coal allocations, etc. It just tells you that our understanding of what is opportunity cost, that 18 years after allocation, it's a generation that we are talking about. It's not about fixing things and getting things right. You have to accept that the reality has changed and therefore you want to give the right punishment for the wrong, you know, the crime, but you also want it to be least costly on the economy as a whole. So moving forward from the judicial reform side, for economic reforms in particular, what do you think are the few key things to focus on?
Thank you, Shamika, and congratulations, Gautam, again. Before I respond to your question, can I make 3 quick points? The first book I read, the earliest book I read, which mentioned reforms in India, was called Aspects of Reform in India. It was written in the year 1886 by a British civil servant who had in mind the reform of the civil services as they then existed in India. The reason I mention this is, yes, this book is called Reform Nation, but there's also a little bit of reform notion in it. In the sense that when we use the word reform, all of us have a certain preconceived notion about what reform is. And we define the government's action in terms of reforming or not reforming on the basis of that. This is a very, very useful compilation, as people have said. Several things have happened. It puts those in one place. But there is a selection bias. And that bias is heavily biased towards the union government. Very broadly speaking, 1991 was about product markets. Post-91 has been about factor markets, very broadly. Factor markets are state government. So the cutting edge, the blunting edge, they're both at the level of the states. And you do not have really an adequate discussion. I know it's going to be your next book, but in this one, you don't have an adequate discussion of that. I also wondered a little bit about why 69. I mean, I thought you had MRTP 69 lurking somewhere at the back of your head. It could have been VAT 69, you were too young. It might have been chicken 69. Maybe you wanted to make it 75 reforms and couldn't think of 6. Anyway, so that's the first point I want to make. The second point, I'm saying deliberately, consciously, we economists have a greatly inflated sense of our importance. We think we determine and influence economic policy. We do nothing of the kind. An economics textbook will say, Mahalanovich 2-sector model, 4-sector model determined the second 5-year plan. You will find no mention of the Mahalanovich 2-sector model in the second plan document. The 4-sector model was published later in Sankhya. We often tend to negate the negative role the economists have played. The consensus of the time, including by economists, was state intervention is good, import substitution is good. That was the consensus. All economists, barring one or two like Shenoy who were ostracized. And exactly similarly, we downplay the importance of the bureaucracy in pushing reforms. A mention has already been made of the political classes. We downplay the importance of the bureaucracy. And when I say bureaucracy, I don't just mean the All India Civil Services. By my definition of bureaucracy now, Montek is a lateral bureaucrat. The reason I'm saying this is look at those earlier government committee reports. The Dagley Committee in 78 on controls and subsidies, when the World Bank and the IMF came along in 1991, they were just recycling those arguments using a different jargon. The Alexander Committee, the Tandon Committee, the Abid Hussain Committee on the positive side. On the negative side, Dutt, Hazari, Karve, whole lot. 1991, I think we simplify when we tend to think Narasimha Rao, Manmohan Singh. The ingredients, and Montek will correct me if I am wrong, the ingredients of the 1991 package were already in place by September 1990, before the elections were at all held. So the much maligned bureaucracy, if it is so maligned, it's a wonder that these 69 reforms have happened. It is a much maligned bureaucracy that pushes the reforms. Coming to your question, rare is it the case that we economists, we will talk about markets, but markets do not function in a vacuum. They are concepts. They function in an institutional setting, and that institutional setting is determined by the constitution and by the legal system. How many economists understand the law? Forget about judges not understanding economics. How many economists bother about the law? Other than Gautam, who has written on the law, in the tomes and the tomes that have been written on faulty economic policies, how many people will mention the IDRA Act? They won't. Now, so far as the judiciary is concerned, it's a long list. But the simple answer is the following. Why do reforms happen? All kinds of different reasons. But one reason why the reforms happen is there is a demand for reforms. There is a countervailing pressure manifesting itself in a democracy like ours through MLAs, MPs, parliament, and eventually gets into the political system. How many of us demand the accountability and transparency on the part of the judiciary? We're perpetually blaming the executive. We are sometimes blaming the legislature. Judiciary, we are not bothered. The police, we are not bothered. So until that happens, I don't think the pressure will mount for reforms.
Thank you, Bibek. Nirmala ji, one question for you. how do we manage the narrative of reforms, especially after the farm laws? It's not about how good the ideas are or how many experts across political spectrum agree that these are important and necessary reforms. How do we win the narrative battle on this?
Well, I'm using your own words. To manage the narrative is one thing, to win the narrative is another. Most often, you win the narrative if you're able to manage it. And there are times when the narrative goes into a spin without much grounding on facts. Then to establish the fact is the labor which you have to put in, and after that you expect that the narrative can rivet itself on the fundamental facts and then go on. Most often it becomes like a gathering moss. It just keeps going and it doesn't gain any facts in its movement. So it could also be used in the case of the farm laws. Whoever had an argument against the economics of it, whoever had an argument about how much discussion has happened across the board, all political parties had vouched for it. So narrative succeeds when it starts early. In anticipation of the problem, if you had started early building a narrative and you're able to run the narrative along with the, let's say, the protests, and if this gains, then you manage the narrative. So narrative is more, I think, the timing. Narrative is more the effort through which you get the whole thing to come down to the hard facts. So the managing of narratives has these two elements which will determine the success of it.
So clearly it is not limited to discussions within parliament or political discourse. It is a public discourse, and hence all platforms need to be mobilized in order to do that. Gautam, now a question for you. And of course, this is all off the, the format that you gave me, but it's just such an interesting conversation. Because I saw how passionate you are in terms of deformers, you mentioned. It's a strong word. And yet, from what Montek said, and I tend to agree to that the distributional impacts, of course, you're worried about it. There is at the back of your head, you're concerned about it, but how do you, that has to be part of the reform, Gautam. So how do we manage that? Let me explain it giving a very simple example. That, when the Green Revolution happened, or for instance, now when the energy transformation, we want just transformation, etc. to happen, technology is a very crucial part of it. That technology is something we have to get from outside. Right? Just as the Green Revolution, most of it came from the Philippines. The government had a very large role in it in terms of getting it and deploying it, which meant working with the farmers, and that in that sense, in the energy transformation, we have to work with the firms to understand exactly what is preventing them from moving en masse to renewable. What are the true costs? What are the compliance burdens, regulatory burdens, etc. When you're thinking of reforms and we're worried, even in the pension scheme, you have to think in terms of that. How do we take this group, which is disgruntled and which is definitely going to lose out? How do we take them along?
So my reading of reforms, what I have seen is that governments tend to cave in to bullying. So the number of, for instance, bank employees may be a small fraction, government employees may be another small fraction, farmers are large, but these small fractions of people have the power because they're going to lose something. That loss is visible to them. And they are more prone to getting together than the rest of us who say we are losing in any case. For instance, let's talk about the pension deforms that we are talking about. Those who are in government service now are demanding a change of a contract or change in terms of service where they will get what some other people, maybe the last 10 years who are going to retire right now, of a defined benefit scheme. it's easy for them to get together. How easy is it for people like us in this room to hit the streets to say, pension deforms must not happen? It's very difficult. We are too busy doing our own thing. It's only when there is a loss to you that a constituency gets formed, either through associations, through trade unions, maybe by getting a political face, maybe by hanging on to some ancient logic or data, or making some emotive statements. For instance, this pension, it's so disgusting. I mean, not only does the person get that pension, after him the spouse gets the pension. After the spouse is gone, if there is an unmarried daughter, she gets a pension. Where is this going to end? What are we doing here? So I think the propensity for those who are losing something or perceiving a loss. By the way, pension funds are doing very well. If you look at the numbers and see those pensions through the NPS scheme, they're doing very well. These people are not going to be in any loss. They just have to find a good annuity. Annuity reforms are needed. So Nirmala ji, just for your information, I think I couldn't help it. This just came out. I think we need reforms in the annuity sector. But if you get a good annuity, I think there is enough capital that can be made over a lifetime to sustain a higher standard of living than even perhaps the current defined benefit plan. It is very difficult for people like you and me to, like you and I can write some articles here and there, kind of bring out some book here and there, but we don't go to the street. Is it now, are we going to, my question back to somebody who is the street going to decide our economic policy? Is the street going to decide our politics? Is the street going to define the way that we engage with one another, our democracy itself? Does democracy have any meaning at all? Or if you just cobble up together, kill a few guys, and the world rushes to, with bleeding hearts, we're going to change our policies? I think this is a question that governments at the union as well as in states, maybe even at a local level, need to face and counter firmly. I think what Nirmala ji said about winning the narrative and starting early, I think that's a brilliant insight. So in terms of economic reforms, we began with constraints. We have now reached conviction, and perhaps the next step is consensus. But to reach that consensus, how do you reach a consensus where you see that you are opposing reforms simply because you're supposed, there is no logic to that opposition. The farm laws, for instance. So I think you gather constituencies, political people feed onto it, suddenly it gets a critical mass, and reforms are held back or reversed or repealed. And I think this is it's a difficult question. I don't have the answer right now, but I think people like Montek or Bibek or Nirmala ji or some other thinkers who've been in the thick of action will be able to answer this question. As an outsider, as a bystander, I can only weep.
Montek, I think we have 5 minutes. Now this is going back to the Prime Minister's call on the Revidi culture. I think eventually we are worried about that because we are too, it's a low middle income country. We are too poor right now to become irresponsible fiscally in the sense of keeping such myopic political objectives, if I may. And this is going back to the pension. And you have said quite publicly that it's a reversal of gains that we have made in the right direction. Now, this is again a unique situation where I think everyone on this dais agrees that going back to the old pension scheme could potentially become, fiscally a huge burden. And yet now we are seeing state after state go back to it. There is a lot of posturing in terms of, even including BJP states, people demanding. How do you bell a cat like this? When clearly, again, the agreement is that the idea is a difficult one. We cannot go back on something which we have advanced on. But politically, we seem to be, again, down that slippery slope. Now, again, how do you manage a situation like this? Is it about political differences? Is it about now, is the economics in some sense bowing at the altar of the political process? which we have to now try and get everyone in the room to agree on something? Do you see that happening? What do you think? How concerned are you about these things?
Well, I certainly share the view that this move is absurd. I mean, it's a recipe for just financial bankruptcy. The big advantage of those who push the move is that bankruptcy will come 10 years later. So I think as an economist, I have nothing to say. The system must prevent both political parties or parties in power not to take steps that will lead inevitably to a financial disaster. How do you do that? Well, to my mind, this is where the narrative comes in. I think we need some effort so that people will explain to the public at large or whatever it is, what are the costs of this? I mean, after all, if you translate it into a simple thing that here's the government willing to give me a better pension scheme than I have, okay? Then if that's the only people who are consulted, I mean, they're going to say, well, look, I like this pension scheme. But clearly, somebody's paying for it. And so we need the narrative to focus on that. Now, somewhere in the political system, those who will bear the cost, I mean, their view has to be heard. And if the political system isn't able to do that, I have no solution. But I'm just saying that, the same thing happens in other countries also. So, we are going through a period where quite a lot of countries are doing politically irresponsible things. But then there is a correction. And the problem here is this is not being done in the central government. I suspect that, there would be much greater national focus if such a move were made on the central government by anyone. It's being done in state governments. So this is where, and this is something that Gautam talks about in the book, looking ahead, that the story of reforms have got to make sense at the state level. There are many reforms that need to be done which don't require the center to do anything. I mean, for example, the decriminalization of all kinds of compliance requirements in state laws. Even if the center didn't want to do it, even if you didn't change any law at the center, there's nothing stopping state governments from doing it. But they're not doing it. And you can make a list of things which are entirely in the realms of the state government. And from that point of view, it's not just the pension scheme. I mean, it's like, what is the pricing policy you're going to follow for electricity? I mean, that is entirely a state government matter. The center doesn't fix tariffs for electricity at the state level. Now, look at what's happening in the climate change area. We all realize, I mean, we have a national target to go down to net zero by 2070. Now, in order to go down to net zero by 2070, we have to bring in renewables. We also have a target for that. But at the state level, if you're bringing in this new investment, which is going to be more capital intensive, etc., and if it raises the price of electricity, are you going to pass that price on or not? Or are you going to say, no, farmers must be free, somebody else must be no low price? I mean, you could have, that problem could arise much faster than the pension problem. But the narrative has to play out at the political level and in newspapers and indeed the informed public so that people are aware that what's happening. Unless that happens, I mean, I don't see an easy solution, frankly.
And yet Punjab is a case study in how things can unravel if it is left to the people and the popular short-term agendas being targeted towards. Because we see this used to be the richest state in the country 18 years back. Today an average, and Haryana was a lot poorer, today an average Haryanvi is 1.5 times richer than a Punjabi. Punjab's per capita income is the same as Nagaland. We still don't know what is Nagaland's true economic model, right? In terms of, is it a growth engine? We're not entirely convinced yet. But Punjab used to be the breadbasket. Within 18 years, a series of myopic policies meant, and that is subsidies to farmers, etc., at the expense of industry, meant that this was It's a case study because this is the only state where we have had active deindustrialization. Not very long back, but when we were in school, 25, 30 years back, all sports equipments came from Punjab. A lot of textiles, sweaters, bicycles, they all came from Punjab. Almost all those industries have pharmaceuticals. They have all moved away. Where did they go? To the neighboring states, right? So sometimes the policies of the state, even if the state can bear the cost of it because you're cross-subsidizing in such a way that you can run this show for some time. But that is the fundamentals of economics, that the incentives over the long term will be such that you are going to, the budget is going to shrink. You're just not going to be able to sustain bad policies over a very long period.
Can I just come
Why
in here?
can't Punjab become a case study? And I don't, it's a very important one because Punjab is looking to go back to that. It's a case study on why we cannot be going back to such myopic because, when it's growth, it's a nice story. Everyone's doing well, we are growing. But the downturn is always going to be very difficult, right? It's painful. It's a border state, so it has added tensions. So perhaps we have to talk a lot more about such things.
I think you mentioned
Well,
narrative. I just
I've
want to
done
come
my
in
bit
here.
on that because I was asked by the then Chief Minister some years ago, I think it was Captain Amrinder Singh, that look, how do we bring Punjab back to the prime position it once had? So we got together a bunch of people and wrote a report, and it required them to do a lot of things, and I'm waiting to see if it gets done. But I think it's not that people don't know. I'm not saying that our report said it. I think if you ask any academic in Punjab, they also know. So you have to ask the question, why is it not translating into a political narrative?
I just want to come in here with one line, that's it. Just then you can take it wherever you want to. I think we've spent too much time, India has spent too much time in glorifying socialism and making it a big virtue. I'm saying give growth a chance, give capital a chance. Capital will create jobs. It will create an alternative model where every person lives a dignified life. We are constantly talking about inequality, as Bibek said in some place, and I think I've cited him also. Let's talk about inequality at $20,000 per capita income. Let's grow. Let's not redistribute poverty. We've done enough of that. And I think we need to give this capital a chance. We need to give growth a chance. We need to get over this momentum of unthinking virtue signaling of socialism. I think it has failed in India terribly. And it's time for another model. Let's go there. And that is the narrative, I would say, that all of us here, the government, the thinkers, media, he mentioned, need to follow.
Vivek
By the way, you shouldn't
Yes.
call it socialism, huh? Because, let's be accurate. The guy who first talked about, I don't care about the color of a cat as long as it catches mice, was Deng Xiaoping. And there's no bigger socialist than him. So, we use this term rather loosely. The truth of the matter is there is a lot of confused thinking. If you find it comforting to call it socialist thinking, by all means do so. But it's actually just confused thinking.
Dada, you had a comment. Nirmala ji?
No, just wanting to add to this. You need a sequel to this book. because you have so many things. Actually, even I was quite enamored by, I don't know who said it, by 69. Bibek said it. I can pick up on a few things which are not covered as reforms in this book, which have happened already. So a sequel is very much required. And the fact that the move from, that the passionate appeal, saying move from socialism to something. And I quite agree with what you want to call it as socialism, you may call it, but then there's confusion. That's the point I want to play on. There's no confusion now. I strongly believe in it. Not because I'm part of a government, but there's no confusion now because there's clearly the spirit of what is entitlement versus what is empowerment. And if you're looking at empowering people, there's no entitlement business. You give them the fundamental requirements, amenities, as you referred to earlier. People find their own course to improve their living. Their families can find opportunities, skills can happen. Everybody moves towards a self-respecting way of moving forward. And that's where to remove this confusion which comes up, which Gautam also refers to as get out of socialism. Again, one of the prime points on which your sequel should start with is the 21 budget. Openly said, privatize where government should not be. Move out of it. Leave it to more efficient hands. The public enterprise policy was a distinct voicing of what 91 should have voiced. All right, at that time, I'm not finding fault. What happened in 91 happened, and it was good for India. You opened up, you saw the way in which businesses are now prospering, opportunities are now coming. But what could have been done within the first 10 years or after 91, and even first 10 years or later 10 years after 2000, when the century, the decade started, did not happen for whatever reason. But it's happening now despite a pandemic. A policy has stated that we are no longer looking at socialism, Confucian or socialism. We are looking at clearly privatizing areas where government should not be. Leave it to more efficient hands. Get more money, put more equity, get the businesses happening, jobs coming. But government will have to be in some core areas, which is critical for national security, which is critical for communication, which is critical for defense, which is also critical for some of the primary areas in which government will have to be present. So once you go through the empowering stage, you get out of that feeling that there's somebody who's going to chip in. Instead, I have everything, everywhere with all with me, that I can take care of my family and myself and move forward. Create opportunities. That's the business of the government. So I think that orientation is now completely moved out. 180 degrees change has happened. So your sequel will have to now look at what has that delivered? Has it delivered? Will it deliver? Will it take it to the next 25 years of 2047, where we would want to be a developed country, better, higher income, per capita income, and so on?
Just 1.5 points. The half one is, I'm shooting my mouth off. Why did the states agree to the NPS then? I suspect it was the pay commission then. I'm not suggesting anything to the finance minister, but maybe that would be the trigger for them to reverse what they are trying to do. The one point, today we've allowed foreign universities to begin teaching in India. The first time I heard about this possibility was probably in 2005 or 2006, when the National Knowledge Commission was set up. It's taken us 16 years or 17 years. Question to ask is, why has it happened now? I'm stretching the point a little bit, but I think the reason why it has happened now is enrollment in schools has gone up, even amongst the poor, across all the states. Not always government schools, private schools also. So the demand, now that these students are moving up the pipeline, the demand for competition and opening up in higher education has begun to surface through the students and the parents, which is why I referred earlier to the countervailing pressure. Montek mentioned this anecdote earlier, which I think is a very significant anecdote about the computer. The 69 I can't get out of my head. 60s Bollywood films, the villain is escaping with the heroine on a vehicle. The hero does not try to chase on a vehicle. He would never have caught up. He is astride a horse, doesn't follow the road, and catches the villain. Much of the reforms, I think, do not involve a direct attack. The reforms happen because there is an intergenerational issue. The older people will not want reforms. Reforms are not win-win, they are win-lose. But the reforms happen because there is a newer generation, younger generation, born after 91 or grown up after 91 who want the reforms. That is the bypass that is happening. That's the reason I think that today empowerment has become much more acceptable as compared to entitlement. The origins of socialism actually go back to Varda. And today, I think, were Varda to happen, the expression socialism would not be used. And that has happened because the nature of Indian society has changed.
Well, that's a great note of optimism. And of course, we are a young country, and with such a large young population that also votes, there is a sort of a self-correcting mechanism that we can be optimistic about. I will end this conversation with one small anecdote, which tells us that I think there is also a bit of a dissonance between what we aspire to be, and this is well into the late 1950s, early 1960s, when at that point one of the advisors to the Prime Minister, this was P.C. Mahalanobis, when he mentioned that setting a minimum wage at such an early stage of growth is problematic. It's too high a bar. You're raising the costs too high. Citing Japan, that it took Japan almost 100 years of growth to attain a level at which point they brought in these kind of welfare reforms to say this is what minimum wages should be, thereby enforcing certain benefits and putting costs on the firms to ensure a larger social well-being in the form of a welfare, a minimum wage legislation. India is perhaps an anomaly in a lot of that because we were very young, we were too poor, but we went ahead with what we thought was the right thing. But clearly, in a hindsight, it is one of those things that we felt good about, but obviously the outcome was hugely distortionary. As a result of which, a lot of our labor laws over time just kept getting distorted. It's only now that we're trying to unravel the factor market and labor in particular through undoing some of that. There is a certain amount of welfare that you can afford while you're still that poor. I think a lot of these conversations, Gautam, the onus is on scholars, the onus is on thinkers and youngsters to write about it, to put more evidence. I think the political battles will be fought on that front. But I think, writing a book like this, continuing to build on the narrative of what economic reform for the youth, for the future, the next 100 years for the country's been to be. I think it's an ongoing effort, but we are all fairly optimistic and bullish on India. Thank you all for your time. We have had a very nice.